Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to episode 9 of the JFK assassination, 60 years later. In every autopsy that involves a gunshot wound to the head, the pathologist will conduct an examination of the brain. This stands to reason. They have to cut the brain, they call it sectioning, in order to examine the trajectory of the bullet or bullets and possibly in the process retrieve and preserve bullet fragments. But the thing is that this examination of the brain cannot be done at the autopsy itself. That's because the brain is too soft and malleable and they need to firm it up so that they can section it or cut it like a loaf of bread. And so it's put into a fluid called formalin, which firms up the brain, and then some days after the autopsy, the brain examination is conducted. Now, the official narrative for over 30 years in this particular case was that that's what happened, that the pathologists met some days after the autopsy and conducted an examination of President Kennedy's brain. Now, you'll recall that I mentioned Douglas Horne. Horne was the one that wrote this massive 5-volume book inside the Assassination Records Review Board that put the whole thing together for me. I had read, as I indicated previously, a lot of books on the assassination, and I learned a lot, and I increasingly became convinced that this was a national security state regime change operation, but I never felt comfortable enough to say that I could convict the national security establishment beyond a reasonable doubt until I read Horne's book. And Horne's book put everything together. He took all of the available pieces of the puzzle and he put them in a logical, coherent whole, especially with respect to the autopsy. The autopsy has always been their Achilles heel in this assassination. And I think you're going to see why during the course of this particular episode. Well, Horne's book was written in the late 2000s, and he was serving on the Assassination Records Review Board in the 1990s. He was the chief military analyst or chief analyst for military records. And in the process of having that position, which he was ultimately elevated to, he would also assist the general counsel, Jeremy Gunn, with the preparation of depositions. Gunn was a lawyer and Horne was not. But they would get together and they worked closely together in the preparation for these depositions. So one day, Gunn says to Horne, and this is detailed in Horne's 5-volume book, I want you to do a timeline of the brain examination. They had already conducted all these depositions, and so I want you to examine all the evidence and determine when the brain exam took place and who was present there. Doug says, fine. And remember, Doug has this meticulous attention to detail, and this almost obsessive quest to get everything down right, and truthful. So he goes and does this careful examination of all this evidence to determine the timeline and the participants to the examination. So he returns to Gunn, and undoubtedly with some degree of trepidation, he says, I've got disconcerting news. I mean, that wasn't his exact words, but that was the import. He says, I got disconcerting news here. And Gunn says, yeah, what's that? And he says, I believe there were 2 separate brain exams. Now, the reason that he would have some trepidation here is because the import of this is essentially saying that the pathologists have lied for 30 years, that they committed perjury. It's a pretty stout accusation here. And so Horne is presenting this implicit accusation. He doesn't put it like that, but I do as a lawyer. When you find 2 medical pathologists working for the military that have committed perjury and cover-up, that's criminal conduct there. And there's a reason why this perjury is taking place. It's not just an innocent type of action. And Horne undoubtedly had to have recognized that. And so what was Gunn's response? Jeremy Gunn, the lawyer, the general counsel for the ARRB, says to Horne, well, that was the conclusion I reached. And I just wanted to see if you were going to reach the same conclusion I did independently. Now, how did they figure out that these pathologists had been committing perjury and lying for more than 30 years? Now, don't tell me the military can't keep secrets, because they kept this secret for over 30 years, including through the process of perjury, committing a felony. How did they figure this out? At the first brain examination, they took with respect to the first brain examination, they took the deposition of John Stringer. Now, John Stringer was the official photographer for the autopsy. He was also the official photographer for the brain examination. As far as he was concerned, there was just one brain examination. And at that brain examination, he said he took the photographs of the brain. He said it took place within 2 or 3 days of the autopsy and the assassination. Now, why is that important? Well, because Mrs. Kennedy, Jacqueline Kennedy, had wanted the brain to be interred with her husband's body. And the funeral was going to be on Monday, and the burial Monday afternoon or Monday evening. And she wanted the brain to be there inside the burial plot where the body was being placed. Now, I'm sure you've heard the big controversy. What happened to Kennedy's brain? What happened to Kennedy's brain? Well, that's just a lark. That's just a rabbit trail. It's totally irrelevant what happened with Kennedy's brain. It serves as a distraction. But the most likely thing that happened to the brain was it was interred with the president's body, because according to Stringer, this brain examination took place within 2 or 3 days, which would then enable them to get the brain in with the president's body. At that brain exam, Stringer said, now remember who Stringer is. Now, Stringer is this professional medical photographer. He teaches there at the Bethesda National Naval Medical Center Medical School. This guy clearly knows what he's doing. And he testifies that at that brain exam, that was within 2 or 3 days of the assassination, they sectioned the brain, standard procedure, to determine bullet trajectories. So they show Stringer the official photographs of the brain that are in the official record, and Stringer says, nope, those aren't my photographs. And because the official photograph shows a brain to be intact, no section. Now, there's something you should know about sectioning a brain, that once you section it, cut it like a loaf of bread, you can't put it back together. You can't paste it, and it doesn't automatically just go right back together. It remains a sliced up brain. And so the photograph that they're showing Stringer cannot possibly be a photograph of the brain that he photographed, because the brain he photographed was sectioned up, cut up like a loaf of bread. And so he says, he also says, I don't use that kind of film. And that wasn't the way I photographed the brain, from the angles and so forth. So immediately, something's wrong here. Now, at that brain exam that was conducted 2 or 3 days after the assassination, it was attended by Commander Humes, James Humes, Navy, one of the 3 pathologists, and Commander Boswell, Navy, also one of the 3 pathologists. So you've got 3 people there: Humes, Boswell, and Stringer. Okay. All right, so that's the brain exam as far as Stringer's concerned. However, the ARRB also had the testimony of Dr. Pierre Fink, Army. He was the 3rd pathologist. And Fink said, I was at the brain exam. He says, I attended the brain exam, and it was like 6 or 7 days later, after the autopsy, which also would have been standard. The brain by that time would have been very firmed up to do the sectioning. And at that brain exam, Stringer did not attend. It was some unidentified photographer. But Humes and Boswell attended that second brain exam. So you've got Humes and Boswell that are attending the first brain exam and also attending the second brain exam. And it's Humes and Boswell that are committing perjury for 30 years. They're the ones saying there was just one brain exam. But we know this is how Gunn and Horn figured it out, because you got different participants that are saying, I was there, and then you got Humes and Boswell at both events saying, oh, there was only one. So they got caught. They got caught lying. Now, why is this important? Well, because this is it. I mean, it's over. You're saying, Jacob, what do you mean it's over? You've now established with this perjury and this fraud that the national security state was responsible for the assassination of President Kennedy. This was the power of Horne's book. When Horne put all this together for me, I realized, oh my gosh, it's over now. You see, this is conclusive as far as culpability is concerned. Why? Because there's no innocent explanation here for this fraud. Try to come up with one. That they've kept this fraud secret for over 30 years. They've committed perjury for 30 years, and they got caught. Give me the innocent explanation. You can't do it. There's got to be a criminal reason here for this type of fraud, autopsy fraud. And that was when I realized, I'd been trained as a lawyer, went to law school at the University of Texas, and I practiced law for 12 years. I was a trial attorney. My mind thinks of, okay, what's the evidence here? Does the evidence establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? And it does, because there's no innocent explanation for autopsy fraud. Now, we haven't even examined what they did when they sneaked the body in there. We're talking about an event that took place after the autopsy. But it's an event that conclusively establishes autopsy fraud. And once you establish autopsy fraud, it's over because there's no innocent explanation for it. It has to be part of the cover-up. Remember, the plan for the fraudulent autopsy is launched at Parkland Hospital immediately after the assassination, immediately after the president's death. That's when that team of Secret Service agents brandishing guns and threatening the use of deadly force makes sure that they get that body out of there at all costs because they were operating under orders. And the only person who could have issued those orders from a reasonable, logical standpoint is the new president, Lyndon Johnson. There's just no other logical explanation because Johnson's over there at Air Force One at Parkland making room for the casket that he knows is coming any minute now, assuming that Roy Kellerman, the head of that Secret Service team, was successful in getting that body out of there. And Johnson's mission was to get that body into the hands of the military. And so he gets it in the hands of the military, which then conducts a fraudulent autopsy that involves, at the very minimum, a fraudulent brain examination. This goes on. This fraud is kept covered up for 30 years or so. The military can be very effective at keeping secrets here. One of the interesting aspects about this is that this particular event actually hit the mainstream press. The mainstream press got wind of this report that Douglas Horne wrote as part of his duties there at the Assassination Records Review Board, detailing what they had uncovered. And so the mainstream press actually published 2 stories about this in Washington, D.C., in the Washington Post. Now, I think it's fair to say that most members of Congress read the Washington Post, if not 100% of them. The chances that they would miss one article, okay, possible. But to miss 2, I don't think so. One article was written by Deb Reichman for the Associated Press. So this all went out all in the wire services, including the Washington Post, but all the other papers that carry AP stories. And her name is Deb, D-E-B-R-I-E-C-H-M-A-N-N. Her article is entitled, Newly Released JFK Documents Raise Questions About Medical Evidence, November 9th, 1998. The other one is by George Lardner Jr., L-A-R-D-N-E-R Jr., Archive Photos Not of JFK's Brain, concludes aide to review board. Now, if you want to read these articles, and I highly recommend them, you can Google them with the author's name. You can put Kennedy's Brain or ARRB, and you easily find them. Or you can go to an article that I wrote that you can put into Google. Why was the ARRB prohibited from investigating the Kennedy assassination? And there's links to both articles in there. So let me read you some excerpts here from this. This is from Deb Reichman's Associated Press article. The latest batch of John F. Kennedy assassination documents raises new questions about an examination of the president's brain and lays out unresolved discrepancies in other medical evidence. Congress did not direct the review board to reinvestigate the assassination, and the panel issued no formal opinions on any aspect of the controversial murder. Okay, remember what I said, that somebody has slipped a provision into the law that actually prohibited the ARRB from investigating this matter. So when Horn and Gunn discovered this, they couldn't get to the bottom of it. They're prohibited by the law from reinvestigating. So whoever slipped that provision in it was a brilliant thing to do if you don't want these things checked into. But it's a weird thing to do because here they've uncovered fraud, clear fraud, but they can't investigate it. Now, this again from the article. But in the board's efforts to expand and clarify the records, detailed service that suggests 2 different brain exams may have been conducted at the Bethesda Naval Medical Center, raising questions about the authenticity of the brain examined. Now, what Reichman is suggesting there is the second brain obviously cannot be President Kennedy's brain. Assuming that the first brain involved President Kennedy's brain, which is a virtual certainty, the second brain, the one that they've got the photographs in the record, cannot be. Because remember, at the first brain exam, they sectioned it like a loaf of bread. The second brain is not sectioned. It's an entirely intact brain. It's a damaged brain, but it's not sectioned. And so that's how we know that the second brain cannot, the one whose photograph is in the official record, cannot possibly be Kennedy's brain. Now, would they have had trouble finding another brain? Of course not. They're at Bethesda National Naval Medical Center. They have a medical school. We all know that in medical school, they have to practice on organs there. And so there's probably 20, 30 brains and hearts and livers and so forth there in the refrigerated compartment. And so it would have been no problem to get a substitute brain. Again, from the article, quote, and this is quoting Jeremy Gunn, Executive Director and General Counsel of the Board. Gunn says, there are questions about the supplemental brain exam and the photos that were taken. There are inconsistencies in the testimony of the autopsy doctors about when that exam took place. That's a nice way to put it, inconsistencies. These are serious issues. You darn right they're serious issues. The records are now out there for the public to evaluate. So Gunn is saying, we can't do anything about that, but we got the records. They're out there. We clarified the record, and now people can evaluate them the way they want. Again, from Deb Reichman's article, 2 doctors, J. Thornton Boswell and James Humes, told the review board that the brain exam occurred 2 or 3 days after Kennedy's death. Okay. Humes told the Warren Commission that he, Boswell, and a third pathologist, Dr. Pierre Fink, were present when the brain was examined. Now, you see, Humes is trying to conflate the 2 brain exams here. The one that Fink was at was 7 or so days later, not 2 or 3 days later. And Stringer was at the first brain exam, and Fink was not. But what Humes is here, he told the Warren Commission, this is back in 1963, that the people who were present were he, Boswell, and Fink. So he's conflating. This is what's called perjury. But when he testified to the review board in 1996, this is from the article again, Humes did not list Fink among those present. You see, now he's getting caught. So he's, I can't mention Fink now 30 years later because they're going to catch me here. And then Boswell maintains Fink was not there. Well, he wasn't there at the first one, but he was clearly there at the second one because Fink said, I was there. So somebody's lying here, okay? There's no question that somebody's lying, and it's a virtual certainty that it's Humes and Boswell because there'd be no reason for Fink to say, hey, I wasn't, I was there at that brain exam. On the other hand, this is from the article, Fink says the brain exam did not occur until much later. You see, much later than the 2 or 3 days. So he's talking about 6 or 7 days and said, Fink said Humes did not call him until November 29th, 7 days after Kennedy's death, to say it was time to examine the brain. So you see, after the first brain exam, they need a second brain to make it look like any shots that came in from the rear, so they get the new brain that has the damage consistent with that, And that's when they call Fink and say, come over for the brain exam. Now, to Deb Reichman's credit, she contacts Humes, but Humes was ill. He could not be interviewed. And in a telephone interview, Boswell reiterated that the brain was examined at the initial autopsy of the body, and only once more at a separate brain exam a few days later. Boswell said, I doubt very much we would have called him Fink back over for that. So he's accusing Fink of lying now. And Boswell said that the only photos of the brain were taken at the autopsy. So Boswell's saying that there are not even any photographs, that obviously Stringer didn't take these photographs at that first brain exam. This conflicts with testimony the board obtained from Navy photographer John Stringer. I'm reading from the article again, who said he took pictures of the brain 2 or 3 days after the autopsy. Stringer also testified that official photos of the brain preserved at the archives do not match those he remembers taking. He cites discrepancies in the angles from which they were shot and the type of film he used. Okay. And if anybody knows what type of film he used, it's Stringer. He teaches medical photography there at the medical school. Now, here's another factor that Reichman points out. In addition, former FBI agent Francis O'Neill Jr., who watched doctors remove Kennedy's brain the night he died, told the review board that the archived photos do not resemble what he saw. I did not recall the brain being that large. So this is O'Neill, the FBI agent, that is looking at the official photographs in the record and saying, that's not the brain that I saw when I was there during the autopsy. Now, there's another interesting aspect of this. The autopsy report reflects that the brain, the one that has the picture in there now, weighed 1,500 grams. Well, the average size brain of a regular person is somewhere around 1,350 to 1,400 grams. Now, you may say, well, Jacob, Kennedy was a brilliant man, and it's not surprising that he had 1,500 grams. But there's a problem. Everyone agrees that when Kennedy received his gunshot to the wound, a massive amount of brain tissue was blown away. It's logical, stands to reason. Some people said 25%, others said 40%, maybe over 50%. But in any event, a large portion. So there is no possibility that the brain could still weigh 1,500 grams. Because imagine what it must have weighed, with all that missing brain tissue put back in. It's ridiculous. It's just it's an old saying, that oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. Now, this is from Lardner's article from the Washington Post. Doctors who conducted the autopsy on President John F. Kennedy may have performed 2 brain examinations in the days following his assassination, possibly of 2 different brains, a staff report for the ARRB said. The central contention of the report is that the brain photographs in the Kennedy records are not of Kennedy's brain and show much less damage than Kennedy sustained when he was shot in Dallas and brought to Parkland Hospital on November 22nd, 1963. Remember, this is 1998. The assassination took place more than 30 years before. I'm 90 to 95% certain that the photographs in the archives are not of President Kennedy's brain, Douglas Horne, a former naval officer, said in an interview. If they aren't, that can mean only one thing. There has been a cover-up of the medical evidence. In other words, fraud. The article goes on. I'm just reading excerpts from it. O'Neill told the board, this is FBI agent O'Neill, that there was too much of the brain left, and there was not too much of the brain left when it was taken out of President Kennedy's skull and put in a white jar. He said more than half the brain was missing. Showing the brain photographs, O'Neill said that did not square with what he saw. The only section of the brain which is missing is this small section over here, O'Neill said of the photograph. This looks almost like a complete brain. Stringer also said that some photos he took of the autopsy itself were missing. Now ill and unavailable for comment, Humes testified in a 1996 deposition that Kennedy's brain was not sectioned in the way Stringer described. So you've got now Boswell essentially saying that Stringer is over there lying about sectioning the brain, but it's standard procedure to be sectioning the brain. Boswell told a reporter yesterday that the brain was examined in detail at the November 22nd autopsy and once more a few days later. It was the same brain, he said, in the November 25 examination. We decided it was destroyed enough that it didn't need sectioning. Asked about Stringer's recollection of photographing sections, Boswell said he's full of expletive. So now Boswell's over here accusing Stringer of having committed perjury. But when you put all this together, it's clear who's committing the perjury. It's Humes and Boswell, because they were at both of the brain exams, and for more than 30 years, they'd been lying about this. They'd been committing perjury, cover-up. Now, why is all this important? Well, because this establishes criminal culpability. There's no innocent explanation for autopsy fraud. None. Talk to anyone about, can you give me an innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy? Nobody can do it. It's clear evidence that this is what was going on here. Autopsy fraud, which means criminal culpability in the autopsy. And it's inextricably bound up with the assassination itself, because who else would they be covering up with a plan that's launched at Parkland Hospital, immediately on the president's death, when they force their way out of Parkland Hospital and they get the body ultimately in the hands of the military. That's what his mission was. Lyndon Johnson, the new president. The only logical explanation for this is that the autopsy fraud has to be inextricably bound up with the cover-up itself. And who would they be covering up for? Well, there's only one logical explanation, and that's covering up for themselves. Now, over the years, naturally, as you can expect, I get attacked by people. Oh, Jacob, you're just a conspiracy theorist. You're a conspiracy theorist. That was the term that the CIA advised its assets in the mainstream press to start hitting people with, that we're starting to figure out that there was much more to this assassination than just some lone nut. And they send a message out to the mainstream press, their assets, saying, look, start smearing people with this label. It'll be very effective. And it has been. I mean, there are people that are terrified of being called a conspiracy theorist. I don't care. I never look at it in terms of theory. I look at it in terms of evidence, that you examine the evidence and then what are your conclusions based on the evidence. So it's not a theory. It's just simply, it's like what you do in a jury trial. You don't go into a jury trial saying, well, is there a theory as to whether this person's guilty or not? You're looking at the evidence and you're trying to decide whether you should convict him beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's what Horne did. That was the power of Doug Horne's book. Horne, you can tell as you read Horne's book, he didn't care one iota about somebody calling him a conspiracy theorist. Doesn't matter to him. All he's doing is relentlessly looking at the evidence, examining the evidence, and giving the import of the evidence. But one of the funny things that over the years I've learned about handle these people that say, oh, Jacob, you're just a conspiracy theorist, is you say, okay, conspiracy theorist, fine. Can you tell me why they sneak the body in early? And oh my gosh, they look at you with this fear on their face. Jacob, I got to go. I got an appointment. I got to run, But also the brain examinations, that if you hit any of these people with, can you tell me why they conducted 2 brain examinations and why the second brain examination could not possibly involve Kennedy's brain, and why they committed perjury and lies on this thing? Jacob, I have to run now. I got an appointment with my wife. I'm really sorry. See, and then they completely drop the whole conspiracy theory allegation, because it's terrifying for them. This is what I've learned about these people that love employing that term conspiracy theorist. They are terrified. They are absolutely terrified. That's what I've learned. And what are they terrified of? They're not terrified of being assassinated by the CIA or the Pentagon. That's not what they're scared of. What they're scared of is, number one, being labeled a conspiracy theorist. I mean, that is a frightening prospect for them, that their friends might call them a conspiracy theorist. So they don't even want to look at the evidence. But more important, what they're scared of, you see, is the Pentagon and the CIA and the NSA, it's their everything. I mean, it's their security blanket. It protects them from the Reds, the communists, the Muslims, the terrorists, the illegal immigrants, the drug dealers, the Russians, the Chinese, the Syrians. It just protects them from all these scary creatures in the world, North Korea, Cuba, North Vietnam, and so forth. And so to go down any road that implies that their security blanket got into a war with the executive branch of the government and took out the executive branch, or at least the head of the executive branch, it's terribly frightening for them, because where does that leave them? It leaves them, having to confront, oh my gosh, I'm living with this security blanket here that took out the president. So that's why this conspiracy thing is a protective device. It's like a shield for them. But the way you penetrate that shield is you make them confront it. You say, well, can you tell me why they sneaked the body in early? Oh, Jacob, I got an appointment. I got to run. Or can you tell me why there was 2 separate brain exams that didn't involve President Kennedy's brain? Jacob, I got an appointment. I got to run. Sorry. And that's the way you deactivate this conspiracy thing. Now, sometimes I'll just say conspiracy theory. But they're scared when you keep hitting them with the same question, because there is no innocent explanation, none, for a fraudulent autopsy, especially when it involves perjury over a 30-year period of time. Now, if you think this part of the autopsy fraud was interesting, wait till you hear the story of Robert Knudsen. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 9 of the JFK assassination 60 years later.